This is episode 105 of Standing Out. Standing Out is a remarkable interview style podcast with the intention to highlight women and men making outstanding contributions in their field. Today, I'd like to welcome Benjamin Hoyt. Benjamin has more than 15 years of experience designing and producing interactive entertainment software. His work includes games and experiences based on global brands, IP such as Marvel, Star Trek, Def Jam, The Witcher, American Girl, Top Gun, and more. He has produced games on two different generations of consoles, PCs, and mobile, as well as location-based experiences such as the Above and Beyond exhibition sponsored by Boeing at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and the Marvel Experience Hyper Reality theme park. Most recently, he provided several AR mobile applications for Crayola and has been particularly focused on location-based VR. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Pomona College in Claremont, California. Benjamin, thanks for being here and welcome.
Hi, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I would love to know how you go from economics to AR VR.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the short version, because you're not the first person to ask me that. The short version is that I think it has a lot to do with the fact that when I first started working in the video game business, which was really in 2000, right after I got out of college, there was still not much in the way of a formal path for getting into video games. Today, you will find quite a few programs at institutions, all sorts of institutions all around the country that allow people to study games, game design, game production, that sort of thing. But at the time, that wasn't the case. And so, really also being a producer is, it's kind of funny because when I started looking for a job in games, I had been working in a sort of a .com startup in the early 2000s. And when that company went out of business, I realized I wanted to work in video games. And I looked around and sort of said, well, what would be an appropriate job for me? And, the answer was an interesting one because it was sort of a process of elimination. It was clear that I couldn't program and I wasn't an artist, and everybody in the business wanted to be a game designer. And so that sort of left production as the sort of default track for people who didn't fit into one of the other categories and who didn't have a sort of specific formal training. And so I was started looking for work as an associate producer, and I had built some relationships in the industry at my previous job, and there was a headhunter who was a friend of a friend who was willing to help me out, and she eventually got me an opportunity in Chicago at a game company that was really probably a little more than I was qualified for, but they were in a position where they needed someone and I was available, and my boss at the time was looking for someone who he could mentor, and it turned out to be a good fit. And so I went to Chicago for a job working at a company called High Voltage Software, and that was really what got me into the world of interactive entertainment content. Right. And I do think that my background, my education served me well. Pomona College is not the kind of place that offers any professional degrees. So you don't come out of Pomona really particularly well prepared for any career. That's not what it's not what their goal is. And I don't think they would say that it is. Their approach, and I really am a believer in it, is about sort of training your brain and teaching you to think critically, and giving you a broad base of, education from which to tackle your career in the world in a broader sense. And I think that they recognize that college is about more than preparing you for a profession. And I believe that's true because having been out in the working world now for quite some time, what I've seen is that when you start a new job, you tend to learn, particularly a junior person. When I hire someone who's entry level, I don't anticipate that they're going to come in and hit the ground running and be super productive. The expectation is that they're going to have to learn, the way that we do things in our company at a minimum, but probably they're going to need to learn, if they're really genuinely entry level, just about everything about the job when they come in. And that's even if they went to some sort of an undergraduate program that was relevant to the field, because the video game and interactive software world is evolving and changing on a continuous basis. And so it's very hard to anticipate, I think, or it's very foolish to expect that a educational institution is going to have been able to teach its students all of the latest techniques and technologies and approaches. And moreover, everybody in our business sort of does everything their own way and slightly differently. It's not a very standardized field. So, I think that having that sort of broad liberal arts background about how to think about the world is really valuable, particularly for what I do. Economics is a quantitative and logical field, and that's a very useful sort of foundation for being a project manager. And, once I was into the video game business, I found myself, sort of transitioning from company to company and moving with the trends of the industry. And that meant starting out first with the traditional consoles and then eventually focusing more and more on mobile games. And then in the last several years, as AR and VR and immersive technology have, become more a part of the industry, I've transitioned into that world as well. And having that generalist background and personality makes those kinds of transitions relatively possible, if that makes any sense.
What is that? So if the industry isn't super process oriented, or I guess standardized might be a better word for that.
Right.
But if the industry is standardized, now I can't say it. But, and you've been through two different generations of consoles, PCs, mobile, things like that. How do you go into the new generations of products, I guess is the question.
Well, so it's a great question, and it's true. Right? I think that the industry is almost notorious for not being standardized. If you compare it to, say, the film industry, where they've had 100 plus years of doing things, and the roles are all highly standardized to the point at which there are guilds and unions that can prescribe exactly who does what on the set, and who can't do what, and that sort of thing. So games are certainly different than that, in that you may find the same person, a person with a completely different title doing the exact same job, or a person with the same title doing a very different job. And that's all I think part of what makes it definitely makes it a challenge, but it the process, ultimately what you're doing, the products are fundamentally very similar, and so the problems that have to be solved at the end of the day aren't that different. And so changes in, this is the way we track a schedule, or this is the way we define a task, or, those sorts of low-level procedural differences are easy to learn and pick up once you understand what the basic activity is that everybody's doing, right? And what I found is that there's actually, my career has taken a fairly circuitous route. I unlike some people who, go to a company and they find a home and they spend 5 to 10 years there or something like that.
Right.
I haven't ever had that experience. And, I think my longest tenure at an employer is in the 2 to 3 year range. And probably my average is more like 18 months. And there are pros and cons that come with that. And it took me a long time, I think, to start to recognize some of the bigger pros. But if you think about it, when you think about a learning curve, right? Learning curves are generally steep at the front end, and then they shallow out after some, relatively short period of time, and then they plateau, and you're really not learning that much after you've been at a company or in a position for, year 3, year 5. You're sort of often repeating the same basic activity. Whereas if you move to a new company after 18 months, in a lot of ways, you're going to drop back down to the beginning of that learning curve, and you're going to get a whole bunch of new information at that new organization, whether it's a steep learn on how they operate and what their process is, or a steep learn on what's uniquely new and different about the challenges of the types of projects that they tackle, because the risks and the approaches for a fighting game are going to be very different than for an online game or a mobile game. And so I found that the sort of silver lining of having bounced around several times like that is that you get this broader base of experience to draw from when it comes to trying to tackle a problem. And at the end of the day, the role of the producer, particularly an internal, what we call an internal producer, the person who's managing the team of people building the game, managing the artists, the designers, the programmers, the sound engineers, the QA people, everything like that. That role is a very interdisciplinary, problem-solving, risk management focused type of job. And so the more different types of challenge, the more different types of techniques for solving problems and managing risks that you've seen and can draw from, I think the stronger you are in that position. And so, while there are a lot of reasons why I wish that I had found like a home where I could just settle in and be there for the extended, long run and just sit there hitting home runs every year or two. I do think that, there are some benefits from having had this sort of more journeyman experience in the industry in terms of my own professional development.
Oh, for sure. I feel like experience is something we undervalue. You know what I mean? It's like
Mm-hmm.
we had to learn
Mm-hmm.
those hard lessons and grow from that. And now we have what we call experience. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's to serve us well. How about, can you
I think it,
go ahead?
I was just going to say, I think it's funny. It's totally true. I agree with you. I remember when I was at my very first job when I was right out of school, and it was the dot-com boom,
Yeah.
and the CEO was a 23-year-old, and we were all, young and supremely confident in our intelligence, and that we could see what was going on with this internet.com thing in a way that the older people just didn't get and everything. And I swear to God, at one point the words came out of my mouth: experience is overrated. And I think that's one of those lessons that you can chalk up to being 22 and bright-eyed and ambitious, but man, it's not. Like it is really something that I value in both myself and the people I work with. So
Yeah. But even look at that journey from when you were 22 and you said that to where you are now. Like all of those things had to happen. Those lessons had to be learned, whatever had to change in your job,
yeah,
your role for you to grow into that. And I think,
yeah,
you talking about college providing life experience, like I think that is so relevant. And I do agree with you that when students come out of college, there's still so much about the job and the workforce for them to learn.
yeah,
And I think in their minds, they're thinking, well, I just went through college. I learned all of that, right? And I can see how
right,
experience is is overrated. In that way.
right. And you think so much, and that's, look, I think that if I'm brutally honest about myself, if you ask me at any given point in my career, going back to the first month after I got out of college and coming all the way up to today, at any single moment, I'd probably tell you I thought I knew a lot. And I think that's part of the hubris, that it's important to be aware of is that, you always think you have the answers, and you always look back and go, man, I didn't know anywhere near as much then as I know now. That's probably going to be true 10 years from now, right? Like I'll probably look back 10 years from now and look at where I am today and be like, geez, what a naive fool I was then, So, I think humility is a really important attribute, for people in general. And my experience is definitely true. It found that, pride cometh before the fall. So, I think that it's understandable to have that feeling, but it's also wise to always be very skeptical of it.
Right, right. That's awesome. Well, as we wrap up, I'd love to know what's on your radar from the AR VR side of things that we as just kind of the general public and listeners might not know about, or just like what's really cool that's happening? I'd love to know what those trends or hot topics are.
That's awesome. So yeah, I mean, I would love the opportunity to say a couple of things about that, because I think that AR and VR are not very well understood, certainly by the public in general. And I think that there are some things that have happened that have, actively worked against them. And so what I would say is that AR and VR are two sides of the same coin. And that's true in a number of respects. First of all, just in terms of what they are, AR is a technology. I like to say that AR is a technology that is about bringing digital objects and characters into the real world, whereas VR is a technology that's about bringing real world people into digital worlds. And if you conceive of them,
so if we're looking, so I have a 10-year-old son. So a couple years ago, he was super into Pokemon Go. So that's AR,
right?
Or that's VR?
That's AR, right?
That's AR.
That's AR. That's you're looking at the real world, and there's a digital Pokemon standing in the middle of it, right?
Yeah, we have
that's an augmented. Yeah. Sorry, say again.
I said we have Pokemon like in the bedroom or the kitchen or wherever. So
yes, congratulations. Your reality has been augmented, right?
Okay.
That's AR. VR is you put on a headset and you can no longer see the real world, but you are in a virtual place, and you can explore the Louvre, or fly through the air, or escape an escape room. Right? Basically, you can be theoretically anywhere in VR, but it's you.
Well, thank you for that
so
first of all. That was awesome.
You're welcome. So then I think the question becomes like, what are the uses for these things, and why should anyone care? And that's where you get to another way in which I look at them. I like to describe them as sort of two sides of the same coin. And by that, what I say is that VR is a technology that's waiting for its market to show up, and AR is a market that's waiting for its technology to show up. And what that means is that there's a lot of really compelling VR tech out there now. The problem is most people aren't aware of it, or they can't afford it, or they don't know where to find it. And so the VR industry is struggling to get awareness and engagement from a large audience. And there are a number of reasons for that, having to do, like I said, with cost primarily. And I think misunderstanding and poor messaging. One of the things that the VR industry did early on was they pushed these really cheap solutions in the form of what you might be familiar with, the Samsung Gear VR, the Google Cardboard, basically different sort of gimmicky VR solutions that leverage your cell phone. And they were enough to give you a sense of like, okay, I get it. That's kind of cool. I can put on this thing on my eyes and then look around and then see another place. But it was grainy. It was sloppy. It might have given you a headache. You couldn't really move very well. It had what we only call, 3 degrees of freedom instead of 6 degrees of freedom. And as a result, I think most people were like, okay, I guess that's kind of neat, but whatever. And then they put it down and they're like, yeah, VR is okay, but boring. And then they moved on with their lives. The problem is that there's really, really mind-blowingly incredible VR experiences available, but you have to have a much more powerful system with which to experience them. And in fact, that system is so prohibitively expensive for most Americans that most people have not even had a chance to see these sorts of things yet. And in answer to your question, what you're going to be seeing more and more of in 2019 is going to be what we call location-based VR, which is going to be VR experiences that you have to go somewhere else in order to experience. And you may have heard of places like this. There's one of the more well-known ones is called The Void, and they have locations at Disney and a few other places, like a half a dozen places around the country. There's a really cool place in Los Angeles that just opened up downtown by the name of 2-Bit Circus, and I know that they're planning to open more locations. Dave & Buster's has begun deploying VR experiences at their facilities. A lot of like Six Flags places have added VR to their roller coasters, and you'll see more and more of that sort of thing coming. And
Okay.
you'll probably see more and more what we call dedicated VR arcades popping up. And all of these places offer high-end premium VR experiences where if someone who's never done VR goes and tries them, I virtually guarantee you that their mind is going to be blown.
Mm.
And so it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens as those become more, as those proliferate and people begin to understand what's possible with VR. As a little bit of a plug here, I'm working on developing a TV show that will leverage VR and give people, the ability to sort of see what is possible in VR. And I'm hopeful that will improve awareness for the technology. So, yeah. So I think that's what I would keep an eye out for on the VR side. I'm happy to speak about the AR too if you're interested.
Yeah, give us a short little, like 1 minute about the AR side.
Sure. So like I said, AR is a market waiting for its technology. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of really exciting applications for AR that people are talking about now, right? If you assume I can look at something in the real world and suddenly get additional virtual, whether it's information or content or it could be, a line that appears in the middle of the room or down the floor showing me where I need to go in order to get where I'm going. Or it could be I'm looking at you and your Facebook profile has popped up next to you and I can see what you did yesterday. Or it could be, anything you could augment the real world with additional digital information. It's very, very exciting. The problem is, more than anything else, is that no one has developed a viable head-mounted solution for that yet. So the only way anyone's interacting and really doing AR these days is by holding up their phone and using it as a lens into that
Right.
virtual world. And that's just not a very long-term satisfying way of doing anything. And so until the head-mounted AR technology is available where you can look around like that without needing to use your hands to hold
Mm.
up the phone, I think AR is going to remain fairly niche. And that head-mounted technology is a ways off. Like I'm not an expert on it. I can't quote anything, but I would personally be surprised if something that was really viable for that was available in the next 3 to 5 years. There's a
Oh,
lot of rumor that Apple may announce something in 2020, and people, I think, are very optimistic about that. I'd be blown away. There are a lot of very difficult technical problems, both on the hardware and the software side, that need to be solved before that's a really viable technology. But the sooner the better. I think it's coming, and when it gets here, it's going to change the world.
well, that's awesome. Thanks for being an expert on that topic and clearing it up for all of us who kind of either confuse the two or don't really know where it's going or what the grander plan and purpose is going to be.
Sure,
So thanks. It's
sure.
really fun having you. I
My
appreciate.
pleasure. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to take a moment to talk.
Oh, you're welcome.